Good afternoon and welcome to the Brothers' War. This month, the first battles and the first Union victory since Fort Sumter are fought and won, and both sides decide a grand strategy. If you'd like to see more of my chronological documentary of the American Civil War, be sure to like this video and subscribe. I try to upload once per week, subject to the requirements of the service. Be sure to follow me on Twitter as well, where I'm live tweeting the events of the war day by day 160 years later. If you really like what I'm creating, consider supporting me on Patreon. Links in the description. To begin the month, we look at a skirmish at Fairfax Courthouse, Virginia, where Company B of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment, 50 sabres strong, contends with 1,000 Confederates. The 2nd U.S. sustains 1 killed, 4 wounded, and 1 missing. The Confederacy suffers 25 killed or wounded and 5 captured. Company B commander, 2nd Lieutenant Charles H. Tompkins, will receive the Medal of Honor for taking a carbine from a trooper, firing and killing the Confederate commander, putting the secessionists to rout. The skirmish, however, is inconclusive, as the Union cavalry did not gain the intelligence on the Confederate disposition they were seeking, and the Confederate buildup of troops at Manassas was not delayed. What was far more conclusive was the Union victory at Philippi on the 3rd, part of the West Virginia campaign in the Eastern Theater. General McClellan has launched his offensive to take and occupy the pro-Union portion of Western Virginia and, ideally, from there launch an offensive into Richmond. McClellan dispatched a division under Brigadier General Morris to find and eliminate Confederate forces who have been burning bridges to prevent the Union advance. Morris's division consists of 2 brigades, one under Colonel Kelly and another under Colonel Dumont. They find the location of the Confederate forces and camped near a covered bridge. The Federal plan is to forced march through the night, launch a surprise attack, and pin the Confederate forces under Colonel Porterfield down with Kelly's brigade, then batter them in with artillery from Dumont's brigade. Dumont's brigade then marches through the night, in the rain, 13 miles to the high ground, where they arrive undetected. Kelly's brigade took a wrong turn and is nowhere to be seen. After waiting some time, Dumont opened fire with his cannons at dawn, and after pummeling the rebel line, attacked, charging downhill. It is at this time that Kelly's brigade arrives and flanks the Confederate army, which breaks and flees, pursued by Federal cavalry. This is the first Union victory since Fort Sumter and is a PR success in the North, where the newspapers call it the Philippi Races. To the south, at Hampton, on the night of the 9th, General Benjamin Butler, commander of the Department of Virginia, has devised a plan to eliminate the Confederate raiders operating outside Fort Monroe. The plan is to have Lieutenant Colonel Washburn's brigade move out under cover of darkness from Newport News, then link up with General Pierce's brigade from Fort Monroe, then strike the rebel base at Little Bethel. Night falls, and the plan is put into action. It appears to work perfectly, until the Steuben Regiment mistakes the gray-clad Albany Regiment for Confederates and fires upon them. This has the instant effect of waking up the Confederates at Little Bethel, causing Washburn's brigade to turn around, assuming they've been taken in the rear, dividing Pierce's brigade as half marches on and half turns around, and causing the first known friendly fire incident of the American Civil War. After hours of confusion, everybody is finally brought onto the same page, but while this is happening, the Confederates depart Little Bethel for the far more defensible Big Bethel. The Union forces continue their night march and find Little Bethel abandoned, torch it, and move on without resting to Big Bethel. They find the Confederate forces well entrenched behind ditches and a river from the high ground there. The Confederate artillery opens fire with 20 howitzers and 2 batteries. Pierce's force responded with 3 cannons. Not 3 batteries, 3 cannons, all of them small field guns under Lieutenant Greeble. The Confederate artillery pounds the exposed Union force, while Greeble attempts counter-battery fire with his 3 pop guns. After hours of bombardment, Pierce decides to attempt a double envelopment. He orders a charge. Over open ground. Over ditches, across a river, up a hill, into Confederate lines, under artillery bombardment. Unsurprisingly, the attack goes miserably, and the Union forces are repelled. Pierce's division returns to Fort Monroe, having suffered 18 killed, 53 wounded, and 5 missing. Confederate losses are 1 killed, 7 missing. On the 13th, anticipating that his plan will be adopted instead of General Scott's, General McDowell, in D.C., informs General Patterson, near Harper's Ferry, that he can take Manassas Junction soon, as long as Patterson can cut off Joseph Johnston's army of the Shenandoah from reinforcing General Beauregard at Manassas. He would have to move into the Shenandoah Valley with his army of the Shenandoah. Both Johnston and Patterson command armies named the Army of the Shenandoah. There's 2 of them, 1 Union and 1 Confederate. No later than the 17th. He has 4 days to take Harper's Ferry and subsequently defeat Johnston. This is made easier, as Johnston evacuates Harper's Ferry literally the day after this message is sent, but Patterson had no knowledge of this evacuation, so he splits his force into a Maryland and Virginia detachment, and while he stays in Maryland, he sends that Virginia detachment over the Potomac to take Johnston in the rear. But Johnston has withdrawn to some lovely ground at Winchester. From Winchester, Johnston can retake Harper's Ferry, or cross the Potomac to attack Patterson, or reinforce Beauregard, or even march on Washington. On the 16th, Patterson is ordered by General Scott to cease operations in the Shenandoah Valley, remain in Maryland, and send all available troops to D.C. immediately. Patterson refuses. Scott says that if he is going to refuse, he must attack Winchester. Patterson again refuses. He moves the Virginia detachment to Leesburg, but sends a smaller detachment to take the high ground at Maryland Heights. Scott demands that Patterson attacks Winchester. Patterson responds that he is outnumbered and outgunned. Scott responds by sending 6 more cannons to Patterson on the 29th, but with no harnesses, Patterson cannot move them. He doesn't even have enough harnesses to move the cannons he does have. The Eastern Front, at the end of the month then, is left with McClellan taking the initiative in West Virginia, and we will be talking more about West Virginia later in this episode, Butler losing the initiative on the peninsula, and Patterson being directed from Washington by men who frankly have no understanding of the situation. Due to Johnston's army not being pinned down or cut off, McDowell does not proceed with his planned invasion of Manassas Junction this month. Farther from Washington, in the Western Front, and far from the eyes of those pesky politicians, General Nathaniel Lyon goes on the offensive to secure the insurgent state for the Union. On the 13th, he marches from St. Louis, arriving in the capital of Missouri, Jefferson City, on the 15th. From there, he marches to Boonville and brings us the third battle of this month, and the first of the multiple battles of Boonville. The first battle of Boonville occurred on the 17th of June. General Lyon led a well-trained and highly motivated force to defeat the hastily trained and green pro-Confederate militias. Lyon suffered 2 dead and 19 wounded, and inflicted on the Confederates 14 dead and 20 wounded. From there, Jefferson City is secured, and Claiborne Jackson is defanged. The battle is quite small, and was a minor tactical victory for the Union, but a major strategic victory. From this point, the center of Missouri is secure, and secessionists only hold the fringes. Communications and rail lines allow free movement and communication in the Union-held section, and now the Missouri campaign can switch from an insurgent campaign to topple Jackson's secessionist government to a counterinsurgency, eliminating the secessionist forces still out there. And what of our friends in the 1st Minnesota? Well, it looks like they're going to be sitting out the war in various incredibly boring forts out in the frontier, watching out for raids from the Dakota Territory. As Lieutenant Colonel Miller took command of Companies C and D to relieve federal troops in Fort Abercrombie, it is very unlikely that the Minnesotans will ever take a shot at rebels, but instead be used to free up federal troops who will see glory and death marching on Richmond. In fact, as the 23rd Minnesota Militia Regiment is tendered to federal service and becomes the 2nd Minnesota Volunteers and prepares to go to Washington, it is almost certain that the 1st will serve out their term mere miles away from home. But Governor Ramsey intervened. As the 2nd was drilling and training on June 12th, Ramsey told Cameron, Secretary of War, that the 1st is already trained and could be in D.C. in 10 days, long before the 2nd could be outfitted and trained. 2 days later, Secretary Cameron replied and ordered the 1st to be relieved by the 2nd and ordered Colonel Gorman to report in Washington, D.C. by way of Harrisburg. The order was passed to Governor Ramsey, to Lieutenant Governor Sanborn, to Colonel Gorman, who read it to the men on the 15th. The news passed through Fort Snelling like wildfire and was accepted by the men with loud huzzas and celebration described by a local newspaper as, quote, as wild as a crowd of schoolboys at the announcement of a vacation. Couriers were sent to Forts Ridgely, Ripley, and Abercrombie immediately and received by equivalent celebrations. By the 21st, all of the men of the 1st except the Forts Ripley and Ridgely detachments from Companies A and K, who we'll catch up later, had assembled in Fort Snelling. At 5 a.m., roll call was held. The regiment, at full strength, was numbered 1,023 men, of whom probably 900 or so were present at Snelling. A religious service was held by the regimental chaplain, E.D. Neal, who cut it short when the 2 steamers Northern Belle and War Eagle arrived to carry the men away. At 7 a.m., the men stopped in St. Paul to bid farewell to their families and friends, followed by smaller 15-minute stops at Hastings, Red Wing, Lake City, Wabasha, and Winona. Final gifts were exchanged, and many tearful farewells were had. The boats arrived in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and the men boarded passenger cars headed for Chicago. First class. For many of the men, this is their first time ever in a train. The regiment arrived in Chicago on the 23rd at 6 p.m. and was welcomed by, quote, hearty and enthusiastic cheers, and greeted by Mayor Wentworth himself. The men paraded through the city, but their stay was short. They boarded the train for Harrisburg at 1 a.m. on the 24th, rode through the day, passed through Pittsburgh at midnight, and arrived at Harrisburg at 10 a.m. on the 25th, where Companies A and K were waiting for them. A small party was thrown at their arrival. At 3 a.m., the party ended, and the regiment boarded trains for Baltimore, where they switched trains, departed late in the afternoon, and arrived at long last in Washington, D.C. at 10 p.m. They were quartered in the city assembly building and were provided supper by one of their state representatives, Cyrus Aldrich. On the morning of the 27th, the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment was moved to their semi-permanent camp and held drill, quote, a short distance east of the capital. They had traveled over 2,000 miles in 5 days. Some closing notes to round out the week. On the 1st, the British Empire declared that neither the Union nor Confederate navies will be able to utilize British ports for the captured vessels, meaning all those privateers to which the Confederacy is issuing letters of marque will have to take their ships elsewhere. It is worth noting that this order applies to all British-owned ports, which is something like 1/3 of all ports in the world. Although this is ostensibly directed at both navies, it has no effect on the US because the rebels have absolutely no merchant navy, and therefore no ships to be captured. On the 2nd, the people of Tennessee voted in a referendum to secede from the United States. Tennessee had already been admitted to the Confederacy, and this referendum was largely symbolic. On the 14th, Robert E. Lee is promoted to 4-star general and retains his position as commander-in-chief of the state of Virginia. At this time, he's largely involved in staff decisions and politics. He's not at present a commander in the field. On the 17th, the Kingdom of Spain and the Kingdom of the Netherlands followed Britain's example set the previous month and declared neutrality in the conflict. Also on the 17th, a provisional legislature in West Virginia votes to secede from the state of Virginia and the Confederate States of America. West Virginia, demographically and culturally, is quite different from the rest of the state to which it formerly belonged. It was settled far later, and culturally and economically it was far more like Ohio and Pennsylvania. Far less cotton, far fewer black people enslaved and free, and with a strong unionist and even abolitionist sentiment. However, the state of Virginia does not recognize the right of the people of West Virginia to secede. But McClellan has recently defeated the secessionist forces, and the closest troop concentration is Johnston, in the Shenandoah Valley. There's very little he can do about the secession without putting Beauregard and Manassas at risk. Francis Pierpont is elected provisional governor of West Virginia, and the Unionist government is recognized by the Lincoln administration on the 25th. To conclude, on July 29, 1861, we see Union High Command, consisting of Lincoln, the Secretary of War Simon Cameron, General Scott, and General McDowell, deciding their grand strategy for winning the war. Scott proposed the Anaconda Plan, and McDowell proposed a direct march to Richmond by way of Manassas. Lincoln, recognizing that many 3-month enlistments are about to be up, favors the latter. Lincoln is also under considerable pressure from the northern newspapers to end the war quickly. The Confederate Congress will meet again on the 20th of July, and if they are allowed to do so, it will be a considerable PR coup for the rebels. McDowell knows Beauregard's forces, the Army of Northeastern Virginia, 20,000 strong, are holed up near Manassas Junction, and if he could strike there, he could remove the primary Confederate force. At the same time, General Johnston stands just outside Harper's Ferry and threatens to reinforce Manassas, but McDowell will have the numbers advantage if Patterson can pin Johnston down. The plans were presented to the cabinet last month, and it is only now on the 29th that the cabinet chooses McDowell's plan. However, McDowell makes it clear that he needs more time to prepare his men, that they are severely deficient in arms, uniforms, and training. Lincoln responds, quote, "You are green, it is true, but they are green also. You are all green alike." The Confederates choose at the end of this month to take a defensive footing. To quote James McPherson's battle cry of freedom, quote, "The Confederates eventually synthesized into what Davis called an offensive-defensive strategy. This consisted of defending the Confederate homeland by using interior lines of communication to concentrate dispersed forces against an invading army, and, if opportunity offered, to go over to the offensive, even to the extent of invading the North. No one ever defined this strategy in a systematic, comprehensive fashion." No one ever defined their strategy in a systematic and comprehensive fashion. If there is one single sentence that sums up the leadership of the Confederate States of America at this time, it is that. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, give it a like, and if you didn't, a dislike. In the comments, you can leave suggestions for special episodes, questions for the Q&A, and whatever else you'd like to put there. A very special thank you to my dad for supporting me on Patreon. Please be sure to share this video with the history buff in your life, and I'll see you next time, where we will see largely untrained and very green men facing off just outside Manassas Junction and determine the course of history at a small creek in northern Virginia.